know there are a few of you tuning in from the UK because of my Twitter badgering, so thank you very much. I know it's 5 o'clock in the morning in the UK, so good work, UK participants. And thank you all as well for joining me this morning. I know it's sort of, early on a Thursday morning, but we've got a nice crowd gathered for this time on a Thursday morning, and I appreciate you all being here for this discussion organised by the UK-IGF. Our discussion today is titled, How do we ensure the future of creative content online? So we're talking about digital content, intellectual property rights and distribution. But I want to try and avoid getting bogged down into the traditional arguments about IP and copyright. Although we all accept that these issues can't be ignored, they're an integral part of the mix, and it would be like trying to make bread without flour to have a discussion without touching on them. But rather than getting bogged down into the old arguments that we're hearing over and over again, which are important arguments, rather getting bogged down into to those arguments, one of the things that came out of the meeting that we had with the UK stakeholders in March was the fact that we really need to start thinking about the future of online content creation and distribution, rather than chasing our tails trying to sort of regulate and define policy for what is a model that will no doubt in 5-10 years time be dead and buried anyway. We need to start thinking about what lies ahead for creative content distribution online. And so what I'd like us to do is to start thinking maybe about what those models could be in 5 or 10 years' time, and how it might look, and how we might start thinking about regulating or incentivizing, in fact, creation in the future too. So I will be asking my panel to cast their minds forwards. It's an unenviable task at this time on a Thursday morning. I'll be asking them in a moment to sort of start with a brief sort of description of how they see the future and what they think the important issues will be, and also obviously introducing themselves. And my panellists, to warn you in advance, are Dr. Ian Brown from the Oxford Internet Institute, Bill Etchison from Google, Mary Aduma from the Nigerian Internet Registration Association, and Cedric Waholtz from UNESCO. For those of you wondering who I am, my name is Kate Russell. I'm a technology reporter and author, and among other things I host the BBC's website review section on BBC World. I have been working in this arena in the sort of consumer area for about 15 years, so I've watched the internet quite closely over that time and have seen a lot of changes, and I'm hoping that this experience can help me sort of guide and drive the conversation as we go on today. So I would like to start by asking you to imagine the content market in 10 years' time, although I've heard many speakers during the sessions this week so far say that we can't even really imagine what it might be like in 2 years' time. Although if you speak to the boys about IPv6, they'll say, well, it's not going to be any different than it is today. But if we can sort of, cast aside all of those sort of, preconceptions and say, in a world where the internet moves forward at the pace that it's being at the moment, what could the future look like? What I would like to do through these conversations today is answer two essential questions, really. One is, what are the threats to the future of online content production? And then how can we start thinking about safeguarding against those threats so that the industry can still thrive online? So we will start with a little future gazing, and I'm going to throw straight over to Dr. Ian Brown from the Oxford Internet Institute.
Thanks, and thanks for organising this, Nominate, and colleagues, and for inviting me today. Let me give you a sort of a quick bit of future gazing and a quick bit of what I hope is equally important to this, a process of how we might get there. You're right, with such fast-moving technology, it's often difficult to see ahead 10 years. I think actually in terms of creative content, I would say is one area where it's not, because I think actually the future in some ways is already with us, in fact has been with us for quite some time. It's just a question of making it evenly distributed, as the phrase goes. More broadly, if you go right back to when the internet began to become a mass medium in the mid-90s, there was a lot of discussion then about the possibilities the internet gave to creators, and the idea of the internet as a celestial jukebox, people called it, where this technology could for the first time make potentially all content ever created available to anyone who was interested in it, and of course the critical and issue that has stopped us getting there so far is how to ensure that creators are remunerated for access to their work. So I think technologies like Spotify exemplify what, in a very practical way, what that celestial jukebox can look like, and I hope that in 10 years' time we'll have sorted out the tricky issues that mean that so far the Spotifys and many other products like them are still not quite yet the celestial jukebox. That would be my vision for a decade's time. Why aren't we there? If the technology is largely there, what is it that has been so tricky about the compensation of the artists and keeping the different stakeholders in the sort of the content ecosystem happy? That's clearly where the difficulties are. We've had a lot of debate about that in the UK over the last few years, where there have been several independent inquiries commissioned by the government, one by the former editor of the Financial Times, Andrew Gowers, in the middle of the last decade, one more recently by a professor who was at Bournemouth University, I think at the time, Ian Hargreaves, that produced some very sensible suggestions on that very question. Unfortunately, the political blockage then came in implementing the suggestions. So let me just say a little bit about that, and I hope it'll open up the debate about how we might fix what I think are the political problems, not the technical problems, in getting to the celestial jukebox. I work with an NGO in the UK quite a lot called the Open Rights Group that looks at online copyright as one of its big issues. They have been talking recently to our Parliament's Select Committee on Culture, Media and Sport, which is right now doing an inquiry on the future of copyright and related issues. And what they have suggested, which I think are some good points I'll just throw out for discussion. One is that reform of copyright licensing is really important, especially in Europe, where we still have a very fragmented market for creative works. The 27 different member states have all managed to implement the supposed uniform European copyright directive in different ways. The potential number of options in that direction is astronomical, because if you look at the different ways that exceptions, for example, can be implemented in national law, I think there are about 19 billion different combinations, and all of the member states have done it differently. Yes, you want some flexibility for member states, but clearly that's not working, because the internet is wonderful for providing a mass audience for works. But if you as an artist or as an intermediary that's trying to sell into those 27 markets are having to deal with all these different combinations of legal framework, that's going to make things much more difficult for you. So I think that's important. A second suggestion, looking more broadly, of course this isn't all just about copyright, there are other government policy areas as well. So improving access to cultural heritage in libraries, museums and archives. The EU has been funding a project called Europeana, which is trying to make a lot of printed works available. Europe obviously has enormous cultural heritage from the last several thousand years, obviously very little of which remains in copyright, and that can provide great source material for today's artists to remix and repurpose, as well as more broadly stimulating the creative economy. And then finally, just for now, two final points. One, that there is more attention paid to the voices of creators themselves, rather than what often happens to trade associations and intermediaries who have their own perfectly legitimate perspectives, are very active in lobbying government about copyright and related policies, but the Open Rights Group, and I agree with them, thinks that sometimes that moves too far away from the interests of the creators themselves, and I think everybody in the debate would agree that's the important point. Yes, the intermediaries are big, important businesses for the US and European and other economies, but ultimately, with a technology that's so game-changing as the internet, it may be that those intermediaries will look very different in 10 years' time, and we need to be careful not to allow preservation of existing business models to become the goal of copyright and related policies. We need to make sure we think about remuneration for creators, making sure that users get the full benefit from all of this wonderful work that's out there. and this is sort of a part of that. You would hope this would sound controversial, but it is surprisingly controversial, calling for evidence-based policy making in this and all other areas of government policy, of course. You would hope that policies were set on the basis of a good understanding of what the challenges are, what the different policy options are, and what their impact might be. And we very often see in copyright debate that not happening, that you get very partial studies commissioned by specific interests in the debate that are used then to produce headline figures, like the internet is destroying the music industry or is causing the loss of X million jobs or Y billion dollars in revenues to the creative industry. But when you try to actually dig into the studies, you'll find that the studies just aren't available. The headline figure will have come out in a press release perhaps, but then the whole point of doing a study is that other people can come along, look at how its conclusions were reached, and perhaps some of those conclusions might be arguable. And when neutral agencies like there was a study by the US government, I'm sorry, which very specific part of the Department of Commerce I think did this, and similarly by the as part of the Hargreaves review in the UK for the UK Treasury, they said the evidence of the impact of the internet on and of file sharing, particularly on unauthorized file sharing, on the revenues flowing to creators, actually there is no good quality evidence. Full stop. You cannot say the internet is causing X damage or indeed benefit to the creative industries, because there just is not good data to show that either way. So I hope all would agree we need that if we're going to make any sensible steps towards that, what I hope, positive vision of the celestial jukebox, all content everywhere all the time to anyone who would like to access it, with the creators of those works appropriately remunerated.
Ian, thank you very much. Okay, there's going to be plenty of time for questions and comments in a moment, but first of all I'm going to throw it over now to Bill from Google to perhaps give us Google's perspective on how this might play out.
Thank you very much. No, I think this is a fascinating question, and I think the starting point is, as Ian suggested, that the internet has fueled an explosion of content. Not all professional content, but all sorts of content. And I think a couple figures that we could throw in that we have would illuminate that. First of all, there are 325 million websites online in May 2011. 325 million websites. I think that's up, from something like 3 million 10 years ago. We have 5 exabytes of data, much of it cultural, much of it information created every day in 2011. There are 250,000 words written per minute and uploaded on Blogger, which is a Google product, and that's like, I think, 5,000 books per minute. And the one that really always strikes me, because we keep raising it. I mean, when I started giving this speech, I think a year ago, it was 36 hours of video per minute being uploaded to YouTube, and now we're up to 72 hours worth of video every minute. So there's an explosion of material, and the material has become much more easily accessed. So culture, I don't know what you call it, a celestial jukebox. There's a celestial library too, in a way that we didn't have only a decade ago. We digitized, often controversially, but library books from around the world. The part that isn't controversial is the ones that are out of copyright and out of print. In Europe, that means books, I think now before 1872. And I remember going to the library in Ghent, which was is one of our partners, and there were 18th century books on Dutch horticulture that were now available online, free of charge, because they're out of copyright, in Australia or in the South Africa. And there's actually a fair amount of interest. These books, which were in the dusty library halls and seen, I think they were taken out once a year, the librarian was telling me, we're now receiving 1,000 visits a day. And interestingly, the library itself you would think, well, if you can get everything online, no one would want to go there. But no, their actual physical, the amount of visitors that were visiting in person had risen dramatically. And we see the same thing in culture all over the world. Another example is Street View, where you take pictures of the streets and the sites. With UNESCO, we've launched something called World Wonders. And that films all their heritage sites. And the interesting one that I remember is Pompeii. I mean, obviously it's a popular tourist visit and so forth. But after we put it online, the number of people visiting Pompeii actually rose by apparently a quarter than the previous. So, I mean, I think the internet offers dramatic possibilities to expand the access to culture writ large. Now, the questions that you raise are, how do you get the compensation for the creators? And I think there too, despite all the sound and fury, we're moving towards new win-win relationships. And I think, again, YouTube is an interesting example. For YouTube, the most popular videos are music videos. And both YouTube needs that to drive the traffic that it's doing it, and the music industry needs it as the preferred new destination or distribution vehicle. So what we're seeing in YouTube is we instituted something called Content ID, that if a video was put up and it's identified or matched to a copyright holder's material, the copyright holder is sent a notice which says, what would you like us to do with this material? Would you like us, it's your right, take it down? Would you like us just to leave it up? Or would you like us to leave it up and sell advertising next to it? And more than 95%, to my knowledge, of the requests in this done under this system, the copyright holder comes back and says, keep it up and sell advertising next to it. And the revenues at YouTube are growing dramatically. Similarly, Google cooperates with newspaper publishers, web publishers. When you often click on their sites and you see ads from Google, it's the inventory of ads from the Google that are displayed there, and revenues are shared. And publishers receive, I think last year it was $6 billion total was handed out around the world. So I think, you know, we are witnessing win-win models. I think that the internet companies like Google are now reaching out. We've signed royalty deals with dozens of collecting societies around Europe, for example. And yet we're still going to have conflicts as we move to the new internet digital world. I mean, traditional print and paper industries it's a difficult transition for them, and it's only natural that there's conflicts along the lines. What's important, I think, as we go forward is that you, Ian, mentioned the Hargraves report in the UK. We're seeing a growing number of countries adapting copyright to fit the internet and therefore reaping economic benefits from this. You know, good regulation, good copyright regulations that encourage sharing and are opening up new economic possibilities for companies like us and Spotify and others. And we're seeing a good law that's coming into effect, for example, in Canada. The Irish and the Dutch are looking at very, very forward-looking progressive laws. And at the same time, we're seeing, you know, a backlash and some possibilities, some very bad legislation that would move copyright in many ways back to the Middle Ages in places like Germany and perhaps even France. So I think overall the reform is inevitable because the consumers are going, users are on the internet, and the culture industry has to reach them that way. The internet is a hard place to put in a direct pay model, but advertising models work. And if we're creative I know it'll be a transition, sometimes tough transition. There is a way to move forward and construct these win-win models. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Okay, Mary Uduma from the Nigeria Internet Registration Association.
Thank you. I want to start by saying I'm happy to be here to join others to um, deliberate on. I hope you can hear me. All right. Rub mind and deliberate and find a way to not only incentivize but to safeguard. And I want to approach it from the way of from market perspective. For a competitive market, there must be a supply and demand. And as long as there's demand for content online, there will always be the entrepreneurs and the suppliers that will devise or produce this content. And just like the voice or telephony has taken up, and because there's demand for telephony, and then there's supply for telephony, and content in this case is going to grow more and more because of the new environment we have found ourselves being called the internet. Is a new world, is a new environment. I know the issue will be, yes, there are people that do this supply. How do they continue to supply without being compensated? I think that's another thing. I want to use my country where what we call the Nollywood industry. The film industry is growing tremendously, and they're making a lot of money out of the Nollywood. But there's still the problem of copyright because the intellectual property right problems. Our laws are not very defined because there are certain things we have not considered in the online market than in the offline market. So I'm looking at it that in the near future, in the next 10 years, there will still be demand and the supply will continue to grow. And I think the most important thing for the creative artist is that the artist is being compensated. The sharing formula is the most important thing for them. For now, some creative artists that have dealt with the telephony or telcos in my country, they are not well compensated, and sometimes they run back to the regulator to say, look, I produce this music and they are using it, making some money, they are not compensating me well. So I think the commercial relationship between the producer and the service provider needs to be like Google, needs to come to the real win-win, because when he say he has quoted a figure that looks fine, looks high, but in the micro level, what is it? How much can I make out of my music from Google? Who takes the greater share of the win-win, of the sharing formula? What is the sharing formula? That's what the creative artists will be looking at. What is the sharing formula? And as long as there's sharing formula that is acceptable by each party, they'll continue to create. In the next 10 years, I could see that, today, the children that are born in the next 5 years may not carry purse as I have my purse with my money. What would they carry? Their telephone is their purse. There will be content there. There will be things that will help them to continue to be the digital citizen or net citizen. Education today, content in education, device, there are softwares today that teach children from ABC with the device. They just press their button and they're learning, and role playing and learning. So it's content development, but the compensation is the important thing. And for us to safeguard this, we must compensate those that created the content properly. There are bad contents that may not sell in certain environment. Like in my own environment, the adult contents are still illegal, so they may not sell, and there could be restrictions. But I think that the national laws, those that are coming up with national laws, should also take into consideration those the value add area of the content creation. We also the illegal download, and you see that the wireless or the internet is so open. People devise a way of getting the paid content without paying. So those are things that I think discussions like this and multi-stakeholder model that will bring together those that produce and supply should be able to discuss how do we preserve, how do we protect, how do we compensate, how do we continue to create demand for content producers. Thank you for now.
Thank you very much, Mary. Okay, finally, we're going to go to Cedric from UNESCO to hear his position on the argument.
Thank you, Kate, for inviting UNESCO to be part of this important session. Content development is key for fostering pluralistic, equitable, open and inclusive knowledge societies. And that's why we are very pleased to be here and to contribute to this discussion. I myself, my name is Cedric Wachholz. I've worked 15 years for UNESCO and I have different experience also with content development, and I've also worked in the field with different ministries of education where we have worked on curricula, on also content for the educational users and so on. So I want to come to the subject from three different perspectives. One is this hands-on experience of creating content. Second is a more normative perspective. You're asking what will be the future, but I will also want to ask what should the future be, do we want it to be, and also some research we did with OECD, with Internet Society and others. I will contribute with that. So what do we think, or do I think will the model be in 10 years time? It's not an easy question, as you said. I just would like to contribute from 4 different angles. One is diversity, second is inclusiveness, third is quality and relevance, and fourth is accessibility. The first one is, I think UNESCO is very well known, and particularly in this crowd for the diversity dimension. And we have launched different studies and disseminated it here. We stress the importance of locally relevant content also in local languages. And today, English is not the first language on the internet anymore, and there's a high opportunity for that. And I think one perspective and one trend is diversification and including in terms of languages. We will see more and more languages and content in more and more also local languages, and therefore also more locally relevant content. Second point on inclusiveness. We want content, of course, to be accessible and created by all, including women, the young and the old, those with little skills and resources too. And we know that that actually content creation becomes an increasingly complex area. You have new technologies, new platforms, new formats, and how to use content and how to move from pure content to content experiences is a question across different platforms, and how to enable users to distribute the content throughout these different platforms, where it's not only text and PDF format anymore, becomes more and more complex. So for us, there is a capacity building dimension to that and to the future, but also the importance of the goal of inclusiveness. And yes, so on. I'll be short. The third point, quality and relevance. You're right, William, that there are, 325 million websites and so on. These are incredible numbers. But it is also a question how content is not only there, but also compelling, easy to access, and relevant and of high quality. So you have a lot of content which is not, and of high quality content which is not actually accessible. We have the language dimensions, but we have also more and more paid for content. I mean, if you do research, you need to often pay for content. And you have also, of course, to deal, if you have this high quantity of content, with the questions of quality. and there are different stories I could add to that, and just a personal one. I have an abonnement to a newspaper which I received, and I was cut off for two months, and I made this experience of only being based on RSS feeds in my news intake, and it was quite incredible how diminished your views get as a personal experience the moment you only base your content intake on RSS feeds, which are specialized to your needs. That is perhaps a personal side note, but it is quite relevant, I think. The question for UNESCO of information literacy, how to deal with an information overload, and how to pick up relevant content and how to access it is an important point. So in terms of accessibility, the fourth point I wanted to make, we of course, first the disabilities aspect, content needs to be accessible to all. Secondly, the open access to publicly financed work is very important to us. William laid out some Google win-win models, the advertisement models. I think as a description, I can see also another model in terms of content development, and it is content treated for privacy. That's, I think, an important development and an important trend if you look at it. And we should, I mean, it's a reality, and we cannot describe the reality with advertisement only. I think that's something to be discussed perhaps in terms of accessibility. Then a third one, which is less perhaps popular but very important for us too. All areas of life produce digital contents, and they should remain technologically stable and accessible in their authentic manifestations by current and future generations. What I want to say is that we have an increasing digital heritage, and it's disappearing, and Google has contributed to an important conference we just held in Vancouver on this work. But it is really a concern for us, not only the future of content, but how to have in the future also the digital content which is 20 or 30 years old, our history, our identity, and so on. So that's also remaining the third dimension of accessibility I wanted to just address, and we should be thinking on in the future of content. Thank you.
Great. Well, some really sort of diverse ideas and opinions coming out there. What I'd like to add to the mix, actually, in this respect, is I was having a conversation with some of my Twitter followers last week about this discussion. And one of the models that I've not really heard mentioned today so far is the crowdfunding model, which is now a massively growing movement online. And we're seeing, perhaps content producers turning the remuneration model on its head and seeking some kind of financial commitment from the content consumers prior to actually making the content. And I think this adds an interesting dynamic to the relationship between content makers and content consumers, because in many ways it completely cuts out the distributor and really truly democratizes the process. And then the good thing about this model is you get into a situation where you're not trying to then protect the digital content beyond that. You set a target, you say, this is how much I feel this work is worth to me to create. I'm going to be remunerated to create it. And then if I can get further, then it goes into the public domain and perhaps then enters the advertising model and becomes, whereas Mary said, the problem with this advertising model is how much am I going to? Is it, am I going to spend the next 6 months of my life creating this piece of content and then only earn pennies because I've put it on the wrong platform and I'm not getting a good advertising share? So I think this is a really interesting dynamic to add into the mix as well, and I thank my Twitter followers for that contribution to the discussion. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to questions. Does anybody, first of all, on the panel want to comment about anything that they've heard the others saying so far? No? Okay, any questions from the floor so far? Yes, sir. Microphone is coming your way.
Hello, my name's... Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Hi, my name's Carl Schoenander. I work for the U.S. State Department in the Office of Intellectual Property Enforcement. I just wanted to actually make comments. Will last a minute. Ian, on the study that you mentioned, the Commerce Department study, that was actually not a piracy study. That was a study on the contribution of the IP-intensive industries to the U.S. economy. And as I mentioned yesterday at another panel, the importance of that study was that it was the first time the U.S. government actually did a study on that topic. And as I said, you know, people can have discussions about the methodology, et cetera, but that's what that study was about. Two other points on the sort of the future of creative content online. I think from my perspective, experience has shown is that you need to have a strong legal environment so that creative content online, legal creative content online can flourish, and you need to have the right culture. And I think creating a culture to do that is really, really essential. All sorts of voluntary best practices agreements can help in that regard. We're very hopeful that something called the Copyright Alert System that is being implemented in the United States right now will make a contribution to that. And I'll leave it at that and happy to talk further if people want.
Thank you very much. Anybody else on that point? Anything from remote participation yet? Okay, well, sorry, Helen. Helen Goodman, she's our Shadow Culture Secretary, and she's...
Hello,
okay.
Is this working?
Yes.
One thing that I think is also worth taking into account in this discussion is what's going on in the courts, because it's not just about the initiatives that government take. It's also, I think it's also worth observing that some of the large film and music industries are now winning cases in the courts, and the ISPs are blocking illegal sites. And I think that needs to be sort of factored into the picture of where we're going. And I wonder whether people think that that's sustainable. In the UK, there's also been a lot of discussion with Google, and I'd be very interested to hear what Bill has to say about this, about the order in which websites are put when people search for things. And the creative industry saying we'd like the legal sites up first, not the illegal sites, because if the illegal sites happen to have been popular recently, then we're going to be permanently disadvantaged. And I'd like to know what Bill thinks about that. I was very interested in what Cedric said, and also about the RSS feeds, which your experience of narrowing by relying on that is an experience I've had. I very strongly agree with that. And I think that brings us to an important question about the nature of journalism and what quality journalism is and what quality journalism does. We've got a lot of newspapers folding in Britain at the moment because things are moving online. And in that situation, it's very important that we preserve journalism, because citizen journalism and it just isn't as good, because you don't have the skills, you don't have the investigations, you don't have the resources, and there's the whole serendipity thing. Well, maybe I don't know about something, but maybe I ought to know about something, and maybe someone should tell me about it, which is obviously an experience we're all having this week here in Baku. And finally, I think crowdsourcing is something that's worth pursuing, but I think we also need to be conscious of snake oil merchants. I mean, it's very easy for people to say, you know, give me $10 and I'll make X, and then they just walk away with the $10, which comes back to the point that the chap from the US State Department was saying, we do need some legal frameworks as well as a change of culture.
Thank you very much, Helen. Okay, well, I'm going to throw that first over to Bill. You know, can your algorithms become the unofficial police of copyright and content distribution?
You know, I don't work in this in the UK, and I read the article in the Guardian, but I don't know the real facts behind the dispute or the details. But I think in general, this raises some issues that I can address without actually. Sorry, being able to respond directly to the issue in the UK. I think people, many websites, newspapers, they look on Google as a place that drives them billions of clicks, billions of traffic they wouldn't have. We let them decide whether they want to stay in Google News or stay in the Google web search, and almost invariably they do, because it drives them readers. At the same time, it's far from the only way to survive or create a brand online or attract readers. When I'm looking for a book, I don't go to Google most likely. I go to Amazon, which is the market leader in driving searches for book purchases and so forth. Other types of information, less culturally, it's the same thing. If you're going to book a flight, you often go to Expedia and not Google. So, I think once our role is very important and we have a lot of power, but it's not as important as often it's been shown to be, and in allowing people to get information or allowing them to find the culture that we're talking about here. And I get back to the comment, I should have perhaps commented, you're right, when I say it's $6 billion going to all web publishers around the world, and I go to an individual newspaper, and it probably pays one journalist. So, I mean, sometimes there is what you say. I think it's legitimate that what we're providing doesn't replace what is being lost in the print world. But unfortunately, the print world doesn't exist anymore, and this is a start towards finding those new models. So I think, yes, we admit that there's a transition, and a difficult transition for the traditional journalism, world of traditional journalism, but it's an inevitable one, and we have to find these win-win models that allow, without protectionism to the old models that people don't want to see perhaps as much anymore, allow culture to thrive and journalism to thrive.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to throw it to the gentleman there now.
Thank you very much. I'm Chris Marsich, and I'm the president of the Motion Picture Association's European office. I would like to, first of all, applaud all of the experiments and on new models that are being deployed for remuneration of creators. And we ourselves are involved in trying to find new ways of exploiting works that we create on the internet, and others are doing likewise. I think it's important to keep in mind that there are differences in investment levels in works that are created, and that whilst some of these micropayment models may work for certain types of creation, they will not necessarily remunerate those of us who, for example, invest £1 billion last year in creation of feature films in the United Kingdom, and all of the thousands of jobs, well-paid jobs, I might add, well above average, that depend on those investments. And so, one has to draw some distinctions here and recognize that there are different types of works, and you may prefer the micro works, the new works, the works of individuals, and want to find a way to remunerate those. Good. The other works that are out there also have a purpose, and contribute in a way to the economies of the countries, including in Nigeria. By the way, we work with the Nigerian film industry, with Mr. Madu, for example, on trying to find ways to enable him and the works he creates in Nigeria to find an audience with remuneration for the investment that he makes, which is not an easy job for him in Nigeria, nor is it for us in the UK at the moment. And so, one has to keep in mind those differences. And I think that the panelists, maybe I'd invite them to comment on that and their views on that. Now, Google is busy encouraging a lot of reviews of copyright. Indeed, the Hargraves review had been called the Google review in the UK by journalists. I think you will know, as a BBC journalist, that's what it was called. Okay, fine, let's call them what they are, and Google is certainly within its rights to promote copyright reviews of this sort. But I think we should be straight about who's doing what to whom where. The reviews. Well, it had been said to Hargraves. It was. I'm just reporting on what the journalists said in the UK, and we know that the journalists are worthy of our trust. The other thing I'd like to say is that you know, our colleague from Google referred to initiatives in Germany and France that are steps backwards. You know, what they are trying to do, in my understanding of the objectives of the French government, the German government, is to make sure that the works that are created there, whether it's in journalism or in film, that they're respected and protected to the extent that the law allows it. And I think that, you know, the dispute between Google and the government of France and the French newspapers is emblematic of a problem that we have. I mean, Google is so strong that it's able to say, we will not carry French newspapers. Basically, we will not, if we have to pay them in terms of the negotiations that they're involved in there. That is a big position to have, to be able to say to effectively the newspapers of an entire country, we won't carry you. That matters. It makes a big difference because Google is almost 90% of the search market in France. And so that has to, it's simply a market position that has to be, I think, taken into account when we look at these sorts of issues. In terms of the shadow State Secretary for Culture's questions and comments about the role of the courts, I would say that the courts in the UK have been trying to balance the sorts of difficult public policy issues that come up when one has to look at pirate sites. They've been doing the job. They have looked at whether those sites have any function other than substantially infringing content that doesn't belong to them. And in all of the cases that we have brought to date, the courts have found that the answer is no. Those are not purveyors of democracy, of freedom of expression, of freedom of speech. They are simply there to abuse content that doesn't belong to them, and they make money in the process. And so the courts have, in our opinion, rightly ordered ISPs to block those sites, and the ISPs have blocked them. And I think, as last I checked, I'm not sure about this, Madam Shadow State Secretary, the internet still functions in the UK despite these blocking orders, no? You have an internet that works, yes, that's good. And then, you know, beyond that, I think that the issue of the responsibility of a big player like Google, for example, in dealing with pirate sites is important, and you raise that question as well. We have expressed concerns, and again, I would invite Google to comment on this. They they rank sites and they list sites. They have an algorithm, a mystical algorithm that is claimed to be neutral, but in fact, it's changed every day. And they've recently introduced some welcome adjustments to the algorithm to take into account the extent to which sites are the subject of valid notices for copyright infringement. But they continue to list sites that are condemned by the courts as being substantially infringing, which really makes no sense to me. Those are clearly declared illegal. So, you know, there is room for progress in this. I think that one has to find the right balance. Nobody is saying that Google or intermediaries need to be the judge and jury. But surely when when there are judicial decisions, they too ought to be respected. That is, to me at least, seems to be a reasonable expectation.
Thank you. Okay, well, we have a few comments that we just want to go over and throw to the panel from that. I'm going to roll back to the first one, which was the as I gather your point, is the dilution of the content industry with these sort of micro content, and perhaps you know, the movie makers, the people making the $1 billion or $1 million productions, there needs to be a model for them in consideration as well. We spoke actually earlier, Cedric mentioned something about content experiences, and I think where you're getting at with that maybe is that there is a space in this sort of argument for the grander experience of HD, 3D, creating content in a way that it becomes less piratable, less copyable, and so money can be made from it that way. Is this kind of what you're saying? Oh, it's not on.
What I'm saying is that there's different types of content,
Yes.
and certain types of content lends itself to being experienced in the sort of internet, in an internet-friendly way right now, and maybe remuneration models can be found for that sort of content, if the creators of the content choose to have the works made available in that manner. There are other vehicles for making works available, and not all of it has to be in the manner chosen by Google and YouTube.
Okay, and so and now, Bill, would you like to actually comment on the, because obviously there was the question about the ranking as well, and if Google does become the leading distribution platform, but is also the leading mechanism by which people find distribution platforms, and then there is the suspicion that algorithms are sort of biased in favour of various different elements. How would you respond to that whole argument, messy as it is?
Messy as it is. Well, I mean, in fact, I think there's a. We're not saying that YouTube is the only way or the future. There's James Bond, which goes through the traditional distribution and it seems to do quite well. A lot of the content industry seems to be thriving, and so the new internet world and the new world of YouTube is not exclusive. I think already answered the way in which people find information. I find the 90% figure misleading because it's not the only thing that we're talking about, which is general search. There's a search for specific things that are also search engines and a way of finding information. And if we're going to look at newspapers, for example, what was interesting recently was you looked at the New York Times, which a place where there's a strong brand image, a strong publication, which more and more of its traffic is going directly to the New York Times website, and less is coming through Google. So, I mean, I think that strong brands will thrive, and there are other ways to find information. And so the presentation is a little biased that this is the only way to do things, or only way to find information. On the courts, I recognize I think we've been working constructively in the UK from what I know, but again, I'm not an expert to work on the issue of identifying and bringing down. I know when there are complaints that we've been able to get it down to a really short turnaround time of 48 hours to break the links. But the court cases I'm concerned with I'm more active in the broader European region, and there are a lot of court cases that are placing burdens on intermediaries on the platforms that would call into question or require us to censor or filter, because we would become liable for the material that's put up on YouTube or so forth. And I think that's a danger that's been overlooked here, despite what I've heard. I mean, there's particular cases before the European Court of Justice. The one I know is in coming from Spain, where there was an article put up on El País about a plastic surgeon who apparently, according to El País, had botched some operations. And now the Spanish government plus the subject of the article are suing Google to break the link between his name and this article, rather than going to the creators of the article, El País, and saying, you got it wrong, you have to change it, or you've committed defamation. So I think the issue before the courts is also to avoid this type of responsibility to the platforms that would make it almost legally threatening, or so the liability so high that we would have to block material before it even gets up.
Okay, I know Ian wanted to jump in on this as well.
Just to add a few points to what has been said by the audience, I think first of all on the antitrust / competition issues, I think that is important as a broad issue, not just in this. And I know the European Commission Competition DG is taking action and negotiating with Google, I think, as a very broad information society issue. That is important. I think from watching quite closely the progress of the Hargreaves report, how it was carried out in the UK, reading the evidence that it produced, I think it was done very carefully, very thoughtfully, Hargreaves took a group of experts to the US, traveled around Europe, met people from all the different stakeholders. I really commend the final report as a very thoughtful, balanced report, and I don't think it's helpful in this debate to attack it as the Google report. It was not funded by Google. Google was not a member of the commission, as far as I can see. It was not biased in Google's favor. And I don't, I'm not sitting here as a Google fanboy. There are some things Google does on privacy that I'm not a fan of, but I think it's unfair to try to tar it with that brush. I think it's also very unfortunate. I've heard politicians in the UK do this, which I think is really unfortunate, to actually personally attack Ian Hargreaves, which I think, that's the surest way to get academic experts to say, screw this, I'm not engaging, that's not what I'm here for. I'm not here to play nasty political hardball. I'm here to try to contribute data and analysis and evidence to the debate. I think the court order point is very important. I think it's quite right to say it's courts that should make these difficult decisions, balancing between enforcement of copyright and issues of freedom of expression and so on, which sometimes will be implicated. By no means, not always. Actually, the two cases that the English High Court has considered, the Pirate Bay and the Newsbin case, I think there was really very little issue there, and the High Court was very straightforward in saying these are sites that are facilitating large-scale commercial infringement, and therefore granting an injunction requiring ISPs to block access. I think that's the right way to go about it. I think the wrong way to go about it is to try to say, as is often said in these discussions, that's not fast enough, or it's too expensive, or justice is just too much, and we have to go on allegations of infringement by rights holders. We want expedited blocking of sites without consideration and balancing by the courts of these issues, and I think that would be a really wrong turn to take. And finally, linked to that, another study that I commend to you all by a group at Columbia University called Media Piracy in Emerging Economies, which I think is very relevant for the broader IGF community that's here today. Their number one finding of a 3-year study in Brazil, India, Russia, South Africa, Mexico, and Bolivia was that the efforts to change copyright law and to strengthen enforcement have largely failed. This is quoting the report. And the problem of piracy is better conceived as a failure of affordable access to media in legal markets. So I think, again, we all want there to be better legal offers that will encourage consumers to pay for this material. We can see that work. People sometimes say you can't compete with free. Actually, you can, and companies do it all the time, not least in bottled water in countries like the UK where tap water is drinkable. But in the media market, iTunes has now sold billions and billions of songs that are perfectly available on infringing file sharing sites. But because Apple have made that easy to use, compelling product offer, that has been very successful and has brought a lot of money, yes, to Apple, but also to the artists behind those works.
Before we move on to the next question, and I would like to just sort of throw something. It's not something that anyone can really comment on, but I would like to make a note as well on record that there needs to be a standardisation of the infringement prosecutions. The case of Richard O'Dwyer, who's currently facing extradition to the USA for what was effectively doing what Google does, providing a place where people can search for links to content. Yes, it was people chose to link content that was pirated content, but he didn't encourage them to, and when he knew, exactly as Google say, when he knew it was pirated, when somebody complained, he took the links down, and yet he, as an individual, is still facing extradition to the United States of America for that. So, not really anything that anyone can comment on personally here, but, for the record, there needs to be some kind of standardisation, I think. Now, I know the lady here had a question. This gentleman has the microphone, though, so are you going to be reasonably quick? Yeah, okay, so we'll pop it there, and then we'll come over to you straight afterwards.
My name is David Hughes, and I represent the Recording Industry Association. By way of history, I've spent my whole career in the music industry, about 16 years at Sony Music. I have taken note on a couple of issues, so I don't want to attack Bill too much, but to say that the entertainment industry is thriving when I watched my sales drop 8 to 10% for the past 11 years, that's hard for me to hear, because 2/3 of my friends who are engineers, musicians, and songwriters have pretty much lost their jobs. So to say that my industry is thriving is kind of offensive, I'm sorry to say. Now, to say that it's not affordable is hard because for the price of my latte this morning, I can buy 5 songs on iTunes. Or I can go to Spotify and listen to it for free, legitimately. So again, making this argument that our legitimate channels are not affordable, I don't think it's productive. I honestly don't think it's productive. I understand in developing nations the economies are different, and we have done a lot of things. In the physical world, we used to discount our product as much as 75 to 80% in Eastern Europe, for example, so that we could make music available to those economies. On the internet, it's a little more complicated, but I wanted to go back to the shadow culture minister's comment and Chris's comment. I'm not sure everybody understands exactly what we were talking about when we were talking about the search returns in Google and elsewhere. But as of last Friday, I typed in Adele MP, and the audio population came up Adele MP3 free downloads. And the first 8 websites were all substantially infringing websites. I like physical analogies. So the physical analogy for me is I go to the internet is our main street. It is our hopefully civil society. So if I went into a shopping mall and 80% of the people statistically go to Google, and 80% of those people go to a information booth and say, I would like to get a movie or music. And they are pointed basically by saying, well, you know what? The easiest thing to do is just go into the parking lot and there's a guy with a truck giving out DVDs and CDs for free. That would be the easiest thing. And I have to scroll to the second page of returns to find something that's not an infringing website. We have a big problem with that too. And we're working closely with Google, but the changes that they've made so far have made absolutely no impact. We did another study last week for the music industry at least.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to have to move over to the lady over here now. Thank you. I think what we're getting from this is that, one of the things that we want to find at the end of today is some resolutions, some things that we could take forward as very definite causes of action that we need to follow up. And I think that this is obviously clearly one of them. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Carolina Lorenzon from Mediaset. We actually started out as commercial broadcasters in Italy in the early 80s. So we contributed to financing European production and cultural diversity. We've also launched several, just to understand, for you to understand where I'm coming from. In the past, I would say 7 years, we launched several complaints against pirate sites, but not only, namely versus YouTube. And going back to what the courts have ascertained so far, and it's an important notion that was partially discussed yesterday too, is that there are some business models that moved away from the concept of the safe harbor that was in the DCMA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act in 1998, and also moved away from the limitation of responsibilities in the e-commerce directive that are provided for pure for the definition of intermediaries as mere host. And there is now we're moving towards a definition of what is an active host. So I would say the operators such as YouTube, maybe they don't have editorial responsibilities vis-a-vis rights holders and consumers in the way that broadcasters do, but they are, in a way, competing with us in the advertising market because of the way they curate, if we don't want to say, for lack of a better word, if we don't want to say they organize content, but what they do, they are in the same business. They sell eyeballs to advertising clients. And coming from a commercial broadcaster, I know well how that works. And right now, for our advertising clients, the cost of spot advertising on TV is becoming the degree of substitutability of that spot with advertising around video materials. And when I say video materials is professional and quality video materials on the internet is coming very, very close. So advertising around video materials on the internet is much more expensive than advertising on banners. And correct me if I'm wrong. So not only you have a problem here of IP licensing, and we are willing to be to provide the content that we license, that we create, and that we finance in an at-a-what, anywhere, anytime, any device model. If there's a market, there is a way, and we want to be there, and we don't want YouTube to be the only purveyor of this kind of content to the, especially to European consumers. So I really don't have a question, but I think that I want this panel to note that there is a problem of IP, but that problem of IP boils down to competition, unfair competition in terms of the way we advertise around content online. Because for the time being, broadcasters are, at least in Europe, and I know that in the US the industry is much more regulated, but advertising is regulated both in quantitative and qualitative rules. And that's not only for competition, but also for consumer protection. And online, I mean, to my knowledge, for the time being, the only kind of protection or the only kind of rules that advertising online is submitted to is maybe the Directive of Unfair Commercial Practices, which is not even respected because, for example, I don't think the users have a clear understanding of the difference between editorial content and advertising, which is like the basic rules of advertising on TV. And so what I'm talking about here is that we need a level playing field, not only for IP licensing, but also in terms of sector-specific rules. Thanks.
Thank you very much for making that point. Okay, I'm going to hand the microphone now over to another UK MP who's joined us, Alan Cairns.
Thanks very much. I want to respond to a couple of the points that have been made so far, and I'll go to the points that were made from the music industry just a few moments ago, and the sort of comments I'm hearing are things like defend and protect, and that's natural human instinct to want to sort of defend and protect an industry and a sector. But my suggestion is there needs to be adaptation, and I was so glad that Ian talked about iTunes. That was the very thing that came to my mind, because there needs to be an exchange that will be convenient, simple, low cost, and as soon as we've got that exchange, because whatever action you take, I heard there were things like the changes that were made to Google, they've had little impact, but even if Google responded in every way that was being demanded, innovators on the internet would find ways around it to do exactly the same thing unless there's a convenient alternative. And if we got to such a restrictive practice, then clearly the internet wouldn't be what it is today, and it wouldn't be we wouldn't be in that sort of free state that we like to enjoy. So there has to be a way of adapting, and there has to be a way of developing new ways of drawing the income. And piloting and trying different ways rather than simply defending and protecting the status quo. And I then look to newspapers, and they're trying different things. You have the Mail Online, which is exceptionally successful in terms of how many people read that as a newspaper online, although it still loses money. They haven't yet found their model. The News Corps are trying a paid model with the Times in particular, and they're trying that model to see if that works. And I think that whatever models are tried, some will succeed, some won't succeed. And the crowdfunding that was mentioned, that will succeed in some areas. And I think that the market will find its way, providing industry is prepared to adapt. But the moment that we depend on the courts to defend issue after issue, it's long, it's expensive, it's complicated, and people will simply find ways around it again. So my request and call is that we adapt. And I was so pleased that Ian defended the Hargreaves review, because certainly on all sides of the House of Commons there's sympathy and support behind the Hargreaves review, thinking that it's constructive and that it's a useful contribution to the debate. So I'm not quite familiar with any politician that has lambasted it that is potentially putting an academic off from contributing in that way again, but we've certainly received it positively. I think it's more the journalists that is to blame in this instance.
All right, okay.
Thanks.
Okay, we're going to come back round. Are you going to be? Is it going to be a fairly quick response to you, and then we'll come to the gentleman next to you?
Thank you. I just wanted to be clear about the Hargreaves report. No question of Professor Hargreaves' integrity. He did the job he was asked to do. He did it well. I think that some of the conclusions were based on thin, very thin evidence. But he did a good job. What I was trying to do is pay a compliment in a way to Google, because although they're being very humble and modest, they are lobbying directly and through the many organizations that they support to have these sorts of copyright reviews take place in order to change copyright, which is their prerogative. I think we just need the transparency in the process to understand what is behind the drive and who is behind the drive. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's the gentleman to his right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to comment on what the gentleman down there said, and I think some of the drift of the other comments. I think the fact that iTunes came into being in the United States was, at least in part, a result of the outcome of certain very important court cases in the United States, like the Napster case and the Grokster case and others. So I think it does reinforce my point that an appropriate legal structure allows for iconic companies in the United States, like in the movie business and music business and Google and others to thrive. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're approaching the conclusions part, but if you'd like to make one more last quick comment, sir.
So, with all due respect to the Member of Parliament, I can be riding in a car, sample music, download it for 99 cents, and listen to it immediately. I'm not sure what's more convenient than that, other than streaming through Pandora for free. So if you have something that's more convenient in your mind, please come to me. I've spent my whole career trying to create better business models for the music industry. But people say you have to compete. Competition for me would be another label makes better music and I lose in the marketplace. Or competition would be somebody finds a better way to monetize my product and it puts my distributors out of business. But when somebody takes the product that I created at my cost, gives it away for free, now I'm competing with myself, and they have no cost of production or marketing. It's not competition anymore. It is not possible to compete with free when you're competing with an exact digital copy of your own product.
Okay, we're going to take the microphone down to Helen, and what I'd like to, I think one of the essences of what we're trying to say and what came out of the policy meeting certainly earlier on in the UK is that, we're kind of straying into discussing the current models of distribution, and we need, fortunately or unfortunately, the current players need to perhaps consider that they have to have a fundamental shift in the way that they distribute or the way distribution happens. Helen, go ahead.
Well, I don't know how many people were in a session, I think 2 days ago, when we were talking about public and private functions. And there was a lot of discussion about when private organisations carry out public functions, we should have the same accountabilities that we have on the public services. And that was said with the perspective of cracking down on crime, and that's what people had in mind. But I would like to suggest that that notion applies equally in this space. So when you've got one or two organisations which are very, very large, they are in effect carrying out the public infrastructure function. So it is reasonable for them to be expected to abide by the law and be accountable and, as is happening today, engage with other stakeholders who have an interest in the way those private services are being run.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're approaching the end of the session, so what I would like to do now is come back to our panellists and ask them if they have any sort of thoughts from what they've heard. We want. It's been a great sparky discussion, as these discussions around this topic always are. But we do want to, this isn't just a talking shop. We want to try and come up with some ideas that we can take forwards to discuss, in a more deliberate fashion. So, Mary, I'm going to come to you first, if I may, going the other way around the table, just for a change. Your closing thoughts, and if anything has struck you as being the imperatives that we need to take forwards to discuss in more detail.
What I want to recommend is that there should be differentiation of the creative content. The higher ones should have higher compensation package, and the low ones, well, and again, the truth is that we need to balance openness with privacy and business. The internet has become too open for business people to thrive, to survive. I can't see somebody spending £1 billion producing a high quality content only for it to be pirated and taken for peanuts, for nothing. And such high quality creative works should be given a different model of compensation from the low ones. And on one hand, we are talking about openness. On the other hand, we are talking about control. I think the thing is that we have a self-regulatory guidelines and standards for practitioners, whether you are in the distribution or you are the search engine, the producer, and the rest of them, and everybody taking its own part of the cake to make sure that we have the first word win-win. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Cedric, your closing thoughts.
Thank you. Well, this was a really interesting session for me. It's not honestly said always a framework I'm working in, and I learned from your crowdsourcing as a new model, and I like it very much. And I agree with some and many of the statements made, and I would, in this framework, really acknowledge on one hand the need for legal frameworks to adapt, but most importantly also for a change of culture. We don't have a clear way forward, but there is a moment of negotiation and repositioning, and I think it relates very much with a change of culture. And as overall policy considerations or principles, I think I would continue to insist on the openness, the inclusiveness, the freedom, and the cultural and linguistic diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cedric. Okay, Bill, you've taken quite a battering. What are your closing thoughts?
No, I don't think it's quite a battering. I think that it was a relatively even discussion, and these lines have been drawn before, and I find it disturbing that we're not talking, like you say, more of how to move forward rather than how to move backwards. And I think everyone should take a look at our transparency report, which shows how many requests we're getting from copyright owners, and draw their own conclusions. And I think that there are many ways in which we can find still these win-win models. The old world won't come back. It didn't come back when television was created, replacing radio, when the DVD was going to destroy the movie industry, and so forth. So I think the internet offers the possibilities that I outlined, and that we do have to find and adapt. iTunes and Google now is offering Google Play, so there's a lot of competition in this space for new distribution for books, music, and so forth. And that hopefully we'll move forward. It won't always be smooth, but I think there's no choice. Inevitable.
The most interesting roads are rarely smooth. Ian.
I would echo, I think, Cedric's call that we need a more inclusive and also better evidenced policy development process. Otherwise, I fear we'll still be going round in the same circles in a decade as the technology moves on, without getting all the benefits for users that would be, and for creators that could be possible. I strongly think, as a technologist, my background's in computer security, and actually one of the things that first got me into that as a PhD student was looking at digital rights management tools to try to prevent infringement technologically. And I've got to say that was exhaustively tried and failed, and I fear that attempts to move to new models, like having search engines reprioritize links, like having ISPs block access to alleging sites, will just be yet more whack-a-mole. The infringers will move on. There are many ways technologically that they can do that and avoid those controls, and so I think that is a dead end as a route for trying to make things work better.
Thank you. And for my own part, things that really struck me again is the need to concentrate on moving forwards and look not at how we can monetize this model, which is, we're so entrenched in these discussions these days. Crowdfunding is a very promising way forwards. But also we need to be careful that we don't dilute the content experience, and we make sure that we keep the value end of the experience as well as opening out the bottom end and democratizing the bottom end of the experience. And most importantly, I think, really, is the point that the lady here made, that we need a fair, level playing field for competition in many respects. You know, not least of all, standards in enforcement of copyright infringement. So thank you very much for a very lively discussion. There is a feedback thing on the IGF website for the session. So if you have the time and you want to go and tell them what you thought of the session, we would be very grateful for your feedback. Likewise, the UK-IGF are always open to more contribution from you, especially if you live in the UK. Come along and contribute to our policy meetings. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.